Welcome to our presentation on women in math history. This year's theme, like the national theme for Women's History Month, was celebrating women who tell our stories. And so we always try each year to pick mathematicians that link into that theme if we can. And so the two mathematicians that we chose, and by the way, this is Professor Tanya Easley, and I'm Professor Amy Hoherz. And the woman that Radia Perlman, and the reason I chose her is because she was integral in developing what allowed the internet to be born, basically. And these days, where do we tell our stories more than the internet? We don't. You know, we have social media, we have different ways of connecting with people and different ways of publishing and putting out our stories, and more stories are able to be told because of the internet. So that's why I picked Radia. So without further ado, my presentation is on Radia Perlman. She's known as the mother of the internet, and she was a mathematician, an educator, a programmer, and a network engineer. In her early life, she was born on December 18th, 1951. She's currently 71 years old, and she was born in Portsmouth, Virginia, but actually grew up in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Both of her parents were engineers. They both worked for the U.S. government. Her father worked on radar systems. And at that time, there really wasn't, or at least when her mother went to school, there really wasn't a degree of computer programming or computer science or anything like that. And so her mother was actually a mathematician by education, but she worked as a programmer. Her family was Jewish. I didn't find a lot about her her upbringing, her faith, other than it just mentioned that her family was Jewish. And she played the piano and the French horn in school, and said that a few interviews that I saw with her said she really, really enjoyed, when she was younger, those artistic outlets, writing stories, poems, composing, playing her instruments and things like that, reading literature. That was more joyful for her when she was younger, and she kind of avoided the science and the math because but it came very, very easy to her. She actually said that her mom would help her with her math homework, but she really enjoyed talking with her mother about was literature and music and things like that. She always assumed when she went into a math or science class that she would be the best student, that she would get the best grade, that she would be the one who would be at the top of the class. But she said, and I quote, "I wasn't actually happy about this." So she kind of was a little bit, she kind of fought that natural talent that she had, and but at the same time, it said she pressured herself a lot to get A's. In the interview that I read about her, she said her parents didn't pressure her. She said her parents weren't saying, you have to get A's, you have to be a mathematician, you have to be a scientist, you have to be an engineer, you have to get certain grades. She said it was herself. She had to have straight A's, or she would ruin her record. So she put a lot of pressure on herself to do that. As far as her education, she chose to go to MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's one of the, if you don't know it already, it's one of the top scientific universities in the country still. And she never really considered herself the engineering type. She said, I didn't consider myself the engineering type because I didn't have the desire to take things apart and put them back together or create things and build things. And so she didn't really think she was going to be an engineer. But then in high school, she took a programming class in high school, and that's when she kind of started to consider a career in computers. But still, she kind of doubted herself a little bit because she said when she entered the class, she was the only girl in the class, and all the other students in the class were talking about how they had built ham radios last summer and things, and she was like, hadn't done that kind of thing. It wasn't something that had interested her, and so she felt behind. And she said she didn't get a lot out of that class because she just kind of felt behind the whole time, but it did pique her interest and kind of challenge her to want to figure out the programming and such. And so she attended MIT, like I said, and she attained her BS and her MS in mathematics. And then she had a break after her Master's of Science, and but eventually went back and got her PhD in computer science. She was one of 50 women at MIT at the time, out of 1,000 students. I don't think that would have been all of MIT. That must have been maybe in her program. And she actually lived in MIT's first co-ed dorm. So when she started at MIT, they did not have co-ed dorms, but they started a co-ed dorm while she was there, and she moved into it. And she said she was considered the resident girl. She also said that it was very strange to her because she just had kind of gotten used to the fact that all her fellow students were males, and she said it didn't really dawn on her how unusual it was or that it was strange until she would be in a class with another girl. And then she'd be like, oh, there's another girl in here. And then that's when it kind of dawned on her how unusual it was. And she said she kind of had to remind herself that she was a girl too. like you're one of those too. But it was just because she'd been interested in this field and been around in classes where it was predominantly males, and she just had kind of gotten used to it and just kind of thought of herself as one of the guys or one of the fellow students, and didn't really see herself as an outsider. She actually learned to program in a side project, because remember her bachelor's was in math, and she learned to program in a side project of a physics class. She had a teaching assistant who had a project that he wanted to do, and he asked her if he could hire her as a programmer. She said, I don't know how to program. And he said, I know that, but you're smart, and if you knew how to program, I'd have to pay you. So that's how she ended up programming. One of her very first things that she's very well known for is in the scientific and programming field is she was part of what was called the Logo Group. She was hired as a part-time programmer at the MIT AI lab, and she actually system software such as debuggers. So that was her job. Like her job was to write this system software. And she was inspired to write a new programming language using special keyboards. So you can kind of see the special keyboard. That's her with a child there. And her special keyboard would teach programming concepts to children. So, the keyboard would have basically like code in it that the children could choose a button that would do like a piece of code. And it was known as Tortoise, which is kind of clever. It's Toddler's own recursive turtle interpreter system. And she actually, unfortunately, would we have the internet if she hadn't, but she abandoned the project because she felt working with children as a woman, she might not be taken seriously as a scientist. So she was afraid of that, that bias or that vision that you're not a real scientist, you're just a woman that works with kids. So she enjoyed it, and she actually made some breakthroughs, but she kind of steered away from it because she wanted to be taken seriously as a scientist. She found out actually several years later, someone from MIT hunted her down to tell her that her work in the Logo Group with Tortoise started a whole new field in computer science known as tangible user interface. So it was pretty significant, and like I said, she just abandoned it because she was afraid of being perceived poorly. in her career began at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which later was renamed to something you're probably familiar with, Raytheon. So she worked at this company that's now known as Raytheon. Again, kind of a funny story. As we find out, when you hear people's stories and you hear about how did things happen, so oftentimes things don't go the way that the path that you intended them to go. She was actually planning on doing more with her education, but she said at the time that they didn't have a very good program at MIT for pairing students with someone to advise them for their graduate thesis, and she didn't have any idea how she was supposed to find a thesis advisor. And so one of her friends said, "Hey, why don't you come work for BBN with us?" Because they worked there. So a couple of her friends from MIT said, "Come work with us at BBN if you don't know what you're going to do." And she said, "Okay." And so that's when she started her actual career. Through her career, she also worked for Digital Equipment Corporation, Novell, and Sun Microsystems. And Sun Microsystems is now known as Oracle. She finished her PhD actually 10 years after completing her MS. So she did her bachelor's and her master's kind of back to back, but then she didn't go back and complete her PhD for like 10 years after she'd been working in the field. I wanted to kind of note, like this is not her, was just a kind of a stock photo that I found. But this is what a computer lab or computer company would have looked like back in the 70s, early 80s. You would have had these huge machines. All those machines together probably don't have as much data on them as this laptop right here, believe it or not, or even our phone. It was very early in the days of computers and being able to put a lot of data in a small space and things like that. So you had these big tapes that had to be switched out, big rooms full of computers. It was just very early in the development of computers. I mean, they started in the 40s, 50s, but we were still at this point in the 70s and early 80s. Well, by far, she is most famous for the invention called spanning tree technology. And in older computer networks, so they had developed networks. I meant to put the name of what the networks used to be called, but I didn't, and I'm not a computer person per se, and I can't remember what it's called. But there were networks that they had developed, but data would often get caught in a loop between switches in the network. And it would create what was known as a broadcast storm, filling the links with echoing packets of data. So it would slow the computers down, and it would cause problems because it would slow the computers down, and they didn't know how to get rid of that problem. Because it would just cycle back and forth between the switches. And so she was tasked at DEC, which was the second company that she worked for. They said, they asked her to find if she could find a solution to this. And it was the early 80s, and she actually invented a solution that allowed network designers to assign importance to each switch, which was called a bridge ID or a BID, and create what are known as root bridges. I don't know exactly what that means. I know a little bit what it means, but I don't know exactly what that means. But it was basically solved this problem of things getting caught in a loop because it prioritized data and where it would go and where it would start from. And so, this is a graphic of it. You have your bridges, and then again you would have a root bridge, and then it would branch out. If you want to know more about that, I would recommend that you ask one of our science professors, or not science professors, but computer science professors, or do some research on your own, because I really don't know much about it. The problem that she had when she developed this was very frustrating. It was such a simple solution that now it seems very obvious. It's like, well, of course that's how you would do that, how you would handle that problem. But she's the one who thought of it. She's the one who came up with it. but it was so simple that she struggled to get her fellow engineers to accept it because it was so simple. They struggled to accept that the answer to the problem could be that simple. And she said, my designs were so deceptively simple that it was easy for people to assume I had easy problems. So because she came up with this kind of unique, simplistic, beautiful way of solving things, people would say, well, you had a simple problem. No, she just came up with a simple, elegant solution to the problem. And she said that others that she knew, that she worked with, who made super complicated designs that weren't really technically sound and never worked, and were able to talk about them in ways that nobody understood, they were considered geniuses. But because she came up with this simple solution that she could explain easily and actually worked, people thought, well, that's not very, that's not worthwhile, that's not useful. And so, that was one of the things that she battled throughout her career. In fact, she said that she used to have a manager who regularly asked her, he'd give her a task and ask her to solve it. She would solve it, and he would say, how did you think of that? In other words, did you find that someplace else? Or how would you know that? How would you understand it? So kind of insinuating that he didn't think that she was capable of coming up with something so intelligent, which she said was one of the most frustrating people she ever worked for. But her protocol, the spanning tree protocol, allows the internet to exist. Other achievements and awards. She is actually, when she's asked in interviews, what are you most proud of? She actually says that she's most proud of the book that she wrote called Interconnections. And it is about layers 2 and 3 of computer networks. So I'm not exactly certain what that means, but it describes and explains how computer networks work. And she was able to, again, this is kind of seems to be part of her intelligence and her talent, is she was able to cut through the jargon and the hype and create an easy to understand order. And it was used in a lot of college classes and read by a lot of people in the field that were already graduated from college but learning, the changes and things that were going on in the field. And if you ask, when asked in an interview, she'll say that that's what she's most proud of is that book. She also developed, I started to list them out, and I'm like, I can't even list these out, and I don't know which ones are most important, so I'm just going to say she did a bunch. She did many, many other network protocols. She did some herself. She did some that were improvements to current protocols. She did some where she did collaborations with people, but throughout her entire career, which has been, since the mid-'70s, she's created many, many network protocols that have improved computer networking and programming. She's also a speaker, an educator. She enjoys teaching when she gets a chance, and she really enjoys being a speaker at graduations and things like that. She, again, had just a plethora of awards that were listed, but I just picked out 3 that I thought were interesting. She's in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. She was inducted in 2016. She's in the Internet Hall of Fame. She was inducted in 2014. She's in the USENIX, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce that, but USENIX Lifetime Achievement Award in 2006. And Radia actually still works, and she works for Dell EMC, which is a subsidiary of Dell Computers. So I'm going to end with, and I wanted to also mention that as I was researching her, I don't personally know her or anything like that, but I could not find a picture where she was not smiling. Like, she just seems like such a warm, outgoing person. And so I thought I would end with a couple other quotes from her. One of her quotes is that the world would be a much better place if more engineers like me actually hated technology. Sounds kind of funny. But she says, the stuff I design, if I'm successful, nobody will ever notice. Things will just work and be self-managing. And if you think about that, think about the things that you use and that have lasted and such. The things that are complicated, the things that don't, even if they do what you want them to do, if they're complicated and it makes it more frustrating to use it than to not use it, you usually kind of give up on it. But those things that are eloquent, have a good user interface and things like that are the things that you go back to and that last. So, if you think of social network sites, if you think about search engines, things like that, the things that last and maintain are those things that are simple for the user to use and do what need to be done without a lot of work on the part of the user. And so that's what she feels is ideal when developing something. And then another quote from her says, and I think this is just a wonderful quote in life. Wish that people, that in general, whether it be whatever field it might be, mathematical or whatever, she said, in engineering, the point is to get the job done, and people are happy to help. You should be generous with credit, and you should be happy to help others. So I know as an educator that one of my best resources I've had from the very beginning is other educators sharing things and letting you use things that they've developed. And then as you get better and you develop your own things, and you share those with other educators. The more that we do that, the better that we make each other. Nobody's stealing your things from you. Nobody's, if you found a good way to do something, share that. And but at the same time, don't use something of somebody else's and then not say, well, I actually got that from them. So there's that nice line to kind of follow, that be happy to share, but also give credit to those that have helped you.
As she said, my name is Tanya Easley. I'm an associate professor of mathematics here at Lone Star Kingwood. I'm going to share with you the story of Mary Everest Boole. She is both a mathematician and an educator. So I chose her because after reading through several different biographies, she kind of has my heart. I'm a mathematics person, but I'm also an educator, because before coming to Kingwood, I was actually a secondary teacher for 23 years, and then I've been here for 2. So my life has been about teaching, and the favorite thing I like to teach is math. So that's kind of why I chose her. Mary was both an educator and a mathematician. She was self-taught in mathematics, but she advocated strongly for what we call today, didn't call it that back then, but today we call it inquiry-based learning, where you learn by asking questions. Instead of just being told, you actually are given tools and allowed to discover. And so she's very, very strong proponent of that kind of ideal of education being inquiry-based, discovery-based. And so this quote, only dead mathematics can be taught where the attitude of competition prevails. Living mathematics must always be a communal process, and so, or possession. And so that was from her collected works. She really believed that mathematics was not something that you just kind of competed in to see who could do it first. It was out there for everybody to learn. So here's kind of a timeline of her life. I didn't put everything up here, so I'm going to flip through my notes here. She was born in 1832 to Thomas and Mary Everest. Thomas was a minister who got sick during the pandemic, the flu pandemic in England, so they moved to France when she was very, very young. And they were under the care of the founder or father of homeopathic medicine. They truly believed that homeopathic medicine was the way to go. And so they moved to France to be close to the father of homeopathic medicine. And he put them on a strict regimen. And she actually followed that even after her father was better and they moved back to England. They continued with this regimen. I don't know that I could follow it. It was, I'm going to read it from here so that I get it right. They had to take cold baths, even in the winter. They had to follow a very, very strict diet. It didn't say exactly what the diet was, just said it was very strict. But then they had to take extremely long walks in the cold. And we're not sure if her father recovered because of these treatments or in spite of them. The opinions vary on that one. But her father made a recovery, so they moved back to England. And so during her time in England, or during her time in France, she actually went to a border school, came back home. It didn't really say why that she came back home, but she came back home. They had personal tutors for her because she was very, very interested in education. But she learned very early that she would not be allowed to go to school. And so that was very disappointing to her. I'll get a little more in detail on that in just a minute. In 1850, she met George Boole. She was 18 when she met him. He was 35. They began by just corresponding via mail about mathematics and about a shared approach to learning, because George Boole thought the same way about learning that she did. And so they would correspond through letters. In 1852, he was actually hired to be her tutor. And then when her father died in 1855, he proposed marriage because at that time, her mother was left without a way to supply support for the family. And so he proposed marriage so that he could take care of Mary and her family. And so they were married. They had 5 kids. And in 1864, George died. And kind of an interesting story, that homeopathic remedy came back, that whole regimen. She thought that the way to treat her husband's sickness was basically what happened to get him sick, which the reason why he got sick was because he walked 2 miles in the rain and lectured in wet clothing. Okay, so her answer to solve that and make her husband better was to pour buckets of cold water on him. So it didn't work, but she was widowed. She, in the meantime, she learned, in the course of her life, she had learned so much math. She had helped her father with things at his church, with teaching Sunday school, so she kind of got that education in through teaching Sunday school. She had been a secretary. She had read every book that people would bring her. She had talked to her father's friends about mathematics and about other things. So she became a librarian at Queen's College. She became a secretary for a while, so she was able to support herself through those ways. But it was very tough for her in that time period. So her love of math, she was self-taught. She did have some tutors coming along the way, but she read every book that her father would give her about mathematics. And it was kind of funny. I wanted to read this little tidbit I found about her father. It says, a father had come and visited her dad and said, after the friend left, Mary heard her father talking to her mother, saying he did not know what to do with his children since his son lacked interest in education as he would expect of a girl, but his daughter had the educational interest and abilities he would expect of a boy. And he, quote, said, if only she could go to Cambridge and study mathematics, she would carry everything before her. But what could a girl do learning mathematics? That was from her father. She was very disappointed, but it did not stop her. She continued to read and to learn and to just soak in anything that anybody could give her. One of her first tutors was Monsieur Duplass. She saw him as her hero, as her idol. And he was the person that introduced her to the discovery-based education. He would actually just hand her something, or he would give her a problem, and then he would ask her questions so that the answer came through her handwriting. As one quote said, that her handwriting, there was the answer. And it would be complicated mathematics, but he would question her until she had figured it out on her own. He wouldn't tell her anything. So that particular tutor became her idol and her example for what a teacher should be. Someone that guides, not someone who just hands that information out. And then she was also influenced by her uncle, George Everest. He worked for the Great Trigonometrical Survey in India. That name may sound a little familiar because he was actually honored to have the Mount Everest named after him. And at one point, George asked his brother Thomas to adopt Mary because he enjoyed the conversations about mathematics and knew how much she loved talking about it. And he decided he wanted to adopt her so they could just talk about math all the time, I guess. Thomas and Mary did not go for that. Mary stayed at home. So I want to share a few things, stories from her, because this is about women who tell their stories. Well, Mary told her stories through her publications. She didn't start publishing until she was 50, but she published 22 books and I don't know how many articles that she actually got out there when she finally started writing. This particular article or section came from her book called The Preparation of the Children for Science. And this is the first paragraph in the first chapter, you can see. And it was interesting to me. It says, the present volume is specifically concerned with the preparation of the child for science. It offers suggestions as a means by which the scientific condition of the mind can be induced. I found that wording interesting. Each mother must decide for herself whether and to what extent she wishes to induce this condition. So she wrote that. The whole book is about science. So it's a little bit hard to read. I'm just going to read a little snippet from one of the paragraphs there. It starts bottom on the left and then kind of goes a little bit up on the right. It says, as preparation for learning electricity, do not be satisfied with once showing the child that sealing wax rubbed on flannel will attract bits of paper. But let him have a stick of wax, or better, a common vulcanite comb and a piece of flannel, and keep them, and try all the experiments he wants to try. Let him learn by experience that after a time, the comb discharges and needs to be rubbed again. That if he touches the table with the charged comb, it discharges at once, and he has the labor of rubbing it over again. As soon as he can be trusted to handle a glass rod without cutting himself, let him have one, and an old silk handkerchief. Do not attempt to explain why the comb must be rubbed with the wool or the rod with the silk, but let him find it out. So she was very much a proponent of this idea that math needs to be learned through experience and through science also, math and science, and through experience, through discovery. She is also credited with inventing curve stitching. She has some beautiful designs. The ones I found online were all of other people's curve stitching designs, so I didn't put one on here. But she came up with it, and her words on how she came up with curve stitching. She was a very young child. We're not talking, she didn't do this as an adult. She did this as a child. She says, in my young days, cards of different shapes were sold in pairs in fancy shops for making needlebooks and pin cushions. The cards were intended to be painted on, and there were rows of holes around the edge by which twin cards could be sewn together. And then she says, as I could not paint, it got itself somehow suggested to me that I might decorate the cards by lacing silk threads through the blank spaces by means of the holes, spaces. When I was tired of so lacing that the threads crossed in the center and covered I had to make this a little bit bigger because it was really tiny, the whole card, it occurred to me to vary the amusement by passing the thread from each hole to one not exactly opposite to it, thus leaving a space in the middle. I can feel now the delight with which I discovered that the little blank space so left in the middle of the card was bounded by a symmetrical curve made up a tiny bit of each of my straight silk lines that its shape depended upon without being the same as the outline of the card. And then she goes on and describes it. And then at the end she says, the teacher came not as an outsider thrusting on me the knowledge of something unfamiliar and strange, but as a brother seer more advanced than myself who could show me how to make further progress on a path which I had already entered with the light. So she started out as a child not even knowing what she had discovered, just knowing that she enjoyed that stitching, that lacing of that straight silk thread that suddenly turned into a curve through the lacing of it. And then a teacher come behind her and was like, oh, this is what you've done. And she's like, okay, that's what I've done. So she's credited with curve stitching, which is now called string geometry. And then a few quotes from her Philosophy and Fun of Algebra. This is actually written with kids in mind. This book was written as kind of her storybook to children about math. Okay, it wasn't written for an adult, it was written for children. So bear that in mind. Move to the next screen. It says, when people had only arithmetic and not algebra, and okay, so let me preface this. I read this and I was cracking up myself because the wording that she used tells me she had to have a sense of humor. She had to have a sense of humor. Okay, so I'm going to read this in case y'all can't see this. It says, when people had only arithmetic and not algebra, they found out a surprising amount of things about numbers and quantities, but there remained problems which they very much needed to solve and could not. They had to guess the answer, and of course, they usually guessed wrong. And I'm inclined to think they disagreed. Each person, of course, thought his own guess was nearest to the truth. Probably they quarreled and got nervous and overstrained and miserable and said things which hurt the feelings of their friends and which they saw afterwards they had better not have said. Things which threw no light on the problem and only upset everybody's mind more than ever. I was not there, so I cannot tell you exactly what happened, but quarreling and disagreeing and nerve strain always do go on in such cases. Okay? Then it says, at last, at least I should suppose this is what happened, some man or perhaps some woman suddenly said, how stupid we've all been. We've been dealing logically with all the facts we knew about the problem, except the most important fact of all, the fact of our own ignorance. Let us include that among the facts we have to be logical about and see where we get to then. In this problem, besides the numbers which we do know, there is one which we do not know, and which we want to know instead of guessing whether we call it a 9 or 7 or 100 or 20 or 1,050, let's agree to call it X. And so X entered math, right? And let us always remember that X stands for the unknown. Let us write X in among all the other numbers and deal logically with it according to exactly the same laws as we deal with 6 or 9 or 100 or 1,000. That's her introduction to solving equations. Interesting. Okay? And the story goes on. That particular chapter is a couple of pages long. And then she has the limit to the teacher's functions, which as a teacher, I don't know if anybody in here is interested in teaching or if you're all just math students. As an educator, this one kind of struck me because it goes to the fact that she was all about discovery. She wasn't about telling you how you were going to use the math and the things and the science and the things that you were learning, but more about we're going to give you the skills and then you're going to decide how you're going to use that. So in case it's too small for you to see. But before we begin our stories, there is one principle to which I must call your attention. It is the business of your teachers at school to see that you acquire skill in using certain implements or tools. It is not their business nor mine to decide what you shall make when you are grown up of the skill which you have acquired. I found that interesting as I was reading through this book. And so it kind of jumped out there at me. She really was about teaching the math in such a way that you could discover it, and then it was up to you to learn how to use it. One last story, and it is the square root of -1. I know as a math teacher, those imaginary numbers are killer. Why in the world do we do imaginary numbers? So I was interested, when I was looking through the table of contents, I was interested to see her perspective on negative numbers. And it is interesting. So here you go. Her story on negative numbers. When you come to quadratic equations, you will be confronted with an entity or non-entity whose name is written this way and pronounced square root of -1. Many people let this non-entity persuade them to foolish courses, and then she decides to tell a story. A story is told of a man at Cambridge who was expected to be senior wrangler, but he got thinking about the square root of -1 as if it were a reality, till he lost his sleep and dreamed that he was the square root of -1 and could not extract himself. And he so became ill that he could not go to his examination at all. And then she kind of switches gears. Angels and square roots of negative quantities and the other things that have no existence in 3 dimensions do not come to us to gossip about themselves or the place where they came from or where they are going to or where they're going to in the far future. They are messengers from the as yet unknown and come to tell us where we are to go next and the shortest road to get there and where we ought not to go at present. When square root of -1 comes to you, behave reasonably about him. Treat him logically, exactly as if he were 6 or 9. Only remember to keep well in front of you the fact of your own ignorance. You may never find out any more about him than you know now, but if you treat him sensibly, he will tell you plenty of truths about your X's and Y's and other unknown things. Like I said, she was a teacher and she was a lover of math, and she combined those two well. She started out teaching women in seminars, and then she moved to teaching children. So she believed in educating women and children. Of course, she wasn't allowed to go to Cambridge, but she was allowed to teach other women what she knew and what she learned. And this is actually a quote from a student of Mary's. She says, "I thought we were being amused, not taught. But after I left, I found you had given us a power. We can think for ourselves and find out what we want to know." That's the words he left with Mary. So she died in 1916, leaving behind 22 books and any number of articles that dealt not just with mathematics, but with mathematics, with teaching mathematics, with science and teaching science. And I think it's important for us to look back and see, as educators and mathematicians, appreciate what she's done. So, thank you.
I mean, I'm not sure where it's going to lead us. I mean, just my own personal, and again, I'm not a programmer or anything, so I think a lot of people are scared about it, but I think everything that's been new, people are scared about. Like when first Google came out, teachers were worried, oh, students are going to be able to look up everything. You're never going to, in my opinion, you're never going to get rid of the human element, you know? So there's always got to be someone who progresses that. I don't think we're ever going to have, you know, computers take over everything, so it's my opinion. You know, knock on wood, I'm correct. So, but I think that, I think it'll eventually be a good thing. Anybody have any questions about it? Well, thank you all for coming.
And how you chose to become a professor.
Yes.
Okay, I'll start. So the question was, in case you didn't hear, how did I choose to become a professor of math, of all things? It actually happened when I was in 5th grade. I fell in love with mathematics because of the teacher I had. And so when I graduated from high school, nursing was the big thing. This is kind of the funny story on my side. My parents convinced me that I needed to be a nurse because that's where the money was at. I started college in August. In November, my mother got sick, and I went and changed my major right after she got out of the hospital because I was like, hey, that job's not for me. So I went and became a teacher because that's what I'd always wanted to do. And so I tell students all the time, I'm actually living my dream because this is the only thing I've ever really wanted to do was teach math. And so, like I said, I started 25 and a half years ago teaching in a small little school. I was teaching 8th grade math, and then Algebra 2, because it was a junior high school combined, so I kind of had a bunch of stuff. And I've taught everything from 6th grade math all the way to dual credit calculus. And then I came here 2 years ago because I never thought about being a college professor until I started the dual credit aspect. And someone said, hey, you want to adjunct? And I was like, sure. So I went and adjunct, and I fell in love with teaching at college. And so when an opportunity arose, I made the switch from teaching the high school classes to teaching the college classes. So I'm doing my dream. I'm living it. So
I relate a lot to the mathematician that I spoke about. I always liked math, always when I was a kid, but I also liked literature and music. I played saxophone in high school. I did not sing, everybody was grateful for that. I was in art class all the way through my senior year in high school, and I always liked literature and art and music, but math was the thing that kind of came easy to me. And I don't mean it was always easy, but it was something that that I had a talent for. And so, when I was little, well, let me go to like my senior year. So then, I'm trying to decide what am I going to do in college? And I didn't grow up in a family of money by any means of the stretch. And single mom, small town, but I always, I'm going to college. It just was never a question. I don't know if it was something that my mom instilled in me or what, but so my senior year when I was trying to decide what I want to do in college, I got in my head that I needed to be an engineer. Somebody told me, oh, you're good at math, you're good at science, you should be an engineer. I didn't really know what an engineer was. So I decided I wanted to be a mechanical engineer. And I started university as a majoring in mechanical engineering. And I realized fairly quickly that I didn't really like science that much. I liked math, but I really wasn't that crazy about science. And so I ended up deciding, well, I really want to be a math teacher. I really want to be a math teacher. And I thought back and I thought, silly me, what was I thinking? All I ever played when I was a child was teacher. I would pretend I was a teacher. I would teach my stuffed animals in the basement. I would, get out my little people schoolhouse and play with the little, always wanted to be teacher. And so I don't know why I didn't consider it, I don't know if it was a money thing or just, I don't know what, but anyway, so then I graduated, became a high school teacher, and then after my oldest son was born, then I decided to, my uncle had been a professor at community college, and I always admired him and thought that was that was kind of cool, and but I wasn't real close to him. But I decided I was going to try to adjunct after my oldest was born. So I started adjuncting. I actually adjunct for 15 years, which is part-time professor. For a while at two different colleges, and then I applied here. And I love teaching community college. People are always like, why don't you go to university? I don't want to go to university. I like community college. I like the atmosphere. I like the students. I like all of that. So, and my very, very favorite thing to teach, which again, it kind of took me a while to realize that my very, very favorite thing to teach is statistics. So, yeah.
So from kindergarten to 5th grade, I loved math. Math my favorite subject. And then 6th grade happened, and I hated it because of algebra, and I couldn't understand it, and I hate not understanding things. So there's one piece of advice you can give to students and math students studying. What's one way you can try to understand math better, or just tips on taking different courses in math? Because I know it's kind of.
So I'll try not to jump up on my soapbox because this is my soapbox topic. The way that we teach math right now is horrible as far as when and how we teach it. At some point it became that the sooner and sooner we introduce students to algebra, the better. Most people's brains people's brains develop abstract thinking at different time periods. It's usually between 10 and 16, depending on the person. And so what happens is a lot of students are good math students because they understand the concrete of arithmetic and they are smart, but then they throw them into algebra before their brain is actually ready to think of abstract thoughts yet. So it's not that you're not smart, it's literally that your brain's not ready for it yet. So it's like saying, well, if I stand my kid up 50 times, eventually he's going to learn to walk faster. No, he's not. He's going to learn to walk when he's ready to learn to walk. So what happens then is that students, in my opinion, students get frustrated and think that they're bad at math simply because they weren't ready to learn algebra yet. So if I could redo the system in America, I would not allow anyone to take algebra until about 9th grade. I think teaching 6th graders algebra is absolutely insane. So if you were bad at algebra when you were younger, try it again. You might find you're actually really good at it. You may just not have been ready for it yet. So that's my thought. So I would just say, try it again. Try it a different way, try a different math class. If you didn't like one math class, try, if you don't like if you weren't successful in algebra, try statistics, try, something different.
I'm a math teacher as well, but I did not like math in high school. I didn't like it because of my teachers. When I got to college and I found I had to take math, and my chemistry major went, oh no. But, I got good teachers and to get it, I was ready for it.
And I'm going to say work on discovering it. Don't wait for a person to just explain it to you. If that kind of the perspective of her, go out there. There are games, there are activities online that helps you discover the math. So go out there and discover it, because it'll probably work better if it comes from an internal motivation, because so much of schooling, especially here in America, is external motivation. You want it for the grade GPA, you want it for the passing grade, you want it for this and that. Once it becomes internal, and I will also tell you, this is kind of funny, I've understood lower level math more since I started teaching upper level math, because I kid you not, teaching dual credit calculus, I don't remember the topic, but I remember thinking in the middle of teaching a dual credit calculus topic, that's why I teach that in Algebra 1. That makes sense now. Okay, so because math builds on itself, there are some times when you're in the upper math classes that you go back and say, that's why I learned that.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.